would last for around 2 hours. It's a great pleasure for me to moderate this panel also because the presence is very diversified. We have here the leaders and experts in different fields related to European integration, which shows that European integration may not only be concentrated on issue of membership or not membership in the European Union. So here we will be talking about possible formats of further development of our relations of our three countries with the European Union. And before we start, I would be happy to note only one thing, that each year when we organize the association forum, we really follow the trend of developments of our relations with the European Union, our movement towards European integration. And really last year we concentrated a lot of building the institutional capacity, parliamentary dimension of European integration. We were talking about implementation of the association agreement, while today's year is marked with the more visionary discussion. We're started to thinking what's next, what goes beyond partnership and cooperation, what goes beyond doing our homework. And it's a great pleasure for me to give the floor to our first speaker, Michael Emerson, who is the one of the representatives of the Brussels Center for Brussels the think tanks, CEPS. And before you will start your presentation, you as the biggest knower of Ukraine-EU association processes, what is your take? What could be the gradual dimension of our European integration? Something should be in the middle between implementation of the agreement and running through membership. What is your take on that? Please.
Okay, I'll give you my take on that. But it really comes from, if I can get the PowerPoint show going, do I have to do something here? The technicians, do you get the PowerPoint started? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Olga. My contribution has three keywords to it, as you can see there: updating, upgrading, and wider Europe. And that actually takes us from current orthodox official business called updating through to more far-reaching future orientations, which in fact can take us years ahead, which gets into the question indeed that you've posed. Now, so the context is well known as the high points in this show. I mean, it's quite obvious that the European Union and Europe as a whole is in a period of some turmoil and some uncertainty, considerable problems for geopolitical reasons to do with both Trump, Putin, and President Xi, but then also on our rather our absolutely internal affairs, internal European affairs, the Brexit and the problems of the Balkan enlargement process, North Macedonia recently underlined, and most relevant for this particular audience, pressure coming from the three DCFTA states in favor of some kind of new momentum in the direction of enhanced integration with the EU, to be defined. And that is precisely what I propose to go into. So first, a little remark here on the Eastern Partnership of the Six and the AA Trio. Now, AA Trio, this is a brand name invented by Andreas Kubelius, who will be with us tomorrow, and presented the day before yesterday in Brussels at an event where Luc Devine was already there. I apologize, Luc, you're going to have to hear me again a second time, more or less the same story.
I love following you. AA Trio is standing for the idea that something useful can be done by these three together with the European Union. Now, he has a particular formulation for, if you like, a multilateralization of the three, but that's only one part of it. And there are other brand names that are floating around. AA Plus is one that has been in circulation, but in honor of the former Prime Minister of Lithuania, I just say trio. I think it's a handy expression. By the way, a little bit easier expression than his use of the Berlin Plus analogy, which I think raises some more questions than we need. Right, on the relationship with the EAP, the Eastern Partnership, and the trio, the Eastern Partnership means some useful things at the level of all six together. I would highlight people-to-people contacts and some trans-European infrastructures. But let's be realistic. There are two authoritarian regimes that are not even WTO members. So that means, in terms that we understand for the trio, there's nothing big, political or economic, that can really be engineered with those two regimes. And so while the diplomacy of the European Partnership of the Six is appreciated by everybody, I think the EU side needs to be careful not to exaggerate the rhetoric about the Eastern Partnership's success. It's a useful thing, okay, carry on, but the EAP 6 states, if you talk to them, they are diplomatically polite and appreciative without being wildly enthusiastic. So that leads us on to what, in that case, should or could the trio do together. The trio, one little footnote for the trio, we can call it, if we want to, 3.5, in that, and the 0.5, of course, is Armenia, which has a very particular hybrid status, which is a story to be followed in itself. So anyway, the trio, in my presentation here, can be involved in both updating and upgrading. Now, these two terms are a bit overlapping at the margin, but let us be analytically clear. Updating is a process foreshadowed by the agreements themselves. New EU legislation that overtakes the stuff which is in the many annexes. The new stuff should come in to replace the obsolete stuff. That process is ongoing, and some people would regard that as a really a technical, relatively bureaucratic exercise that has to be done, and quite rightly so. I would say we in our centre in CEPS, we are beginning to look systematically at what the updating business consists of. In fact, it's quite substantial, because many of the annexes are really have been fundamentally changed with new EU legislation, which is a rather drastic revision of what was there before. So don't be too dismissive about the mere updating process. Nonetheless, I would suggest that we maintain or use a distinction between that process and an upgrading concept, which would consist of enrichment and extension of the DCFTAs and complementing their content with actions that are not necessarily inscribed into the text. Now, the updating institutionally is a well-established process. The
Association Council can decide jointly to replace or renovate the annexes. Okay, fine, it's on the way. Upgrading is more difficult because you cannot change the treaty in practical terms. The ratification process is so heavy on the EU side that that has to be excluded. But I will come to how to do it in a moment. Right, on the updating process, I've already commented on that. The only additional remark I would make is that the annexes, if I am not mistaken, Luc, this covers not only the approximation annexes, but also the strict trade policy annexes with the remaining tariff schedules and tariff quota schedules. And so this is a reminder that the Association Council can indeed, if it so wishes, go ahead with completing the trade liberalization process, for which, of course, there are real possibilities. The tariff quota business for agri-food project has actually been changing in some cases in the direction of more liberalization. And in the Ukrainian case, there's on both the EU and the Ukrainian side, there's the outstanding case of substantial remaining protectionism from the automobile sector, which must surely be a candidate for revision at some point if we like the idea of supply chain linkage between modern industries, major industries between Ukraine and the EU. So on this upgrading business, what could it consist of? Now, there are a number of examples up here, some of which indeed overlap with the updating process, but let's not worry about that too much. That's, if you like, a semantic question. But the whole mass of these examples taken together could represent the core to an upgrade of the agreements. I'll say how in a moment. This whole process has actually received considerable impetus under the Poroshenko regime here when he proposed accession to the 4 unions. Now, those proposals, or was it 2 years ago, were rather summarily presented and not particularly well worked out. The customs union idea in particular had serious problems attached to it and has since been dropped. But nonetheless, there was the idea there that it would be possible to go beyond the DCFTA content more in the direction of full participation in EU policies. So the trace of that initial initiative, I think, is still now on the table with discussions underway about deepening the energy relationship between Ukraine and the EU, and indeed the digital single market, not just for Ukraine, but all of these 3 things can concern all 3 of the trio. Now, there are some chapters here too mentioned which are mentioned in the agreements but are not actually executed with the agreements. That is application of the Pan-Euromed Rules of Origin, a very important but highly technical thing, which is kind of underway but is not yet achieved. And the conformity assessment agreements, the ACA agreements, where Ukraine wants to go ahead, which would be possible, but has attached to it strict conditionality with respect to the prior adequacy of conformity with the EU relevant directives and standards. But that would be, I mean, this ACA business is almost incomprehensible technically, but at face value, it means basically being in the single market with respect to technical standards. No checks at the border because you're already all right. Your conformity has been assured. So it's important. new chapters that have developed since the agreements were originally drafted. And candidate number one here is cyber security and cyber defense, two related but different concepts. Cyber defense, you're getting really into common foreign and security policy. Cyber security is more close to, if you like, the digital single market business. But the cyber word hardly present. I don't know if there's one reference to the word in the agreement, but it's largely absent, and that's a candidate for a new chapter. Gender mainstreaming is another example. It has a token reference in some of the labour market directives, but is the idea of gender mainstreaming, which many member states and the EU itself is not present. And then there's the question of whether more investment funding can be brought in behind the extremely expensive commitments in the DCFTAs and the sectoral agreements for energy, environment, and transport. Basically, these are the three big ones which need billions of funding. Now, the EIB and EBRD are already active in these areas, and the Commission's own grant funding mechanism is there too, and they go well together. So really it's a question of scale of operations there. I mean, if you take one important example, energy efficiency in households, which is extremely important for energy conservation, and now this is only moving very slowly because of the problems of developing housing associations, getting grant funding into housing associations where many of the people cannot, as too poor to be valid for mortgage funding by their housing associations. So there's a whole set of problems there that really require substantial grant funding alongside investment funding by EBRD and EIB. Well, that's just one example, but the amplitude of that problem is really huge. And if the DCFTAs upgraded to make a contribution, there's a very good candidate for action. Yes, I finished this particular heading with increased market access. I've already referred to the automobile sector. I don't know, Olga, what the Zelinsky administration, whether it has said anything about that or not. Maybe you'll tell us in a moment. But anyway, it's obviously sitting there, sitting duck as a candidate at some point. Then there's the question of road transport permits, which now becomes a vivid problem, as I understand it, for Ukraine, whose trade in exported manufactured goods into the EU is growing. You're getting beyond just the state of being a commodity exporter. And those big commodities can go by road and ship, largely. But for all of this detailed supply chain linked manufacturing industries, you've got to have very efficient road logistics. And that is impossible because of the present state of the issue of road transport licenses, which is linked, however, to the acquis conditionality for road transport, where I understand Ukraine has commitments that are not yet fully implemented. So you've got a double thing here. Advance the acquis implementation and make somehow an agreement with the European Union for a much better system, an open system of road transport permits. Otherwise, this business of road transport, you're suffocating trade expansion at the macroeconomic level. So it is more than just a sector. It is something that is biting deeply into the most fundamental objectives of the whole DCFTA process. Right, how to do this without ratification? Well, here I think there are 6 possibilities. It's sufficient just to note that in the business of European and international diplomacy, there are many ways of making functionally useful agreements without having treaty status requiring full ratification. MOUs can be memorandum of understanding. I mean, let's say the IMF operates on the basis of MOUs. These are very powerful instruments, and the EU is in there as well. And action plans can be decided by the Association Council. So there's no real problem here of finding non-treaty ways of doing valid updating. A little footnote here, and maybe Luc will comment on this. I noticed when the President-designate of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, sent terms of reference to all of her future commissioners, the Neighbourhood Commissioner had, you should look at sectoral policy deepening. So I'm wondering whether that is ringing bells in DG NEAR and the External Action Service. It should be, because that fits perfectly well with the concept of upgrading. Now, there's another aspect to the upgrading, not just the sectoral policy stuff that I've mentioned, but also the institutional side. Could there be useful things to be done there? Well, the association agreements, the council and their committees, this is already a very substantial institutional structure, and that doesn't need to be reinvented. But are there other things to be done? One obvious idea that some people have suggested is that the Ukraine support group should develop economies of scale and become basically a trio support group for the other two as well. Luc, do you like the idea? Let's see. Do you like the idea? I don't know. The expertise, of course, in the support group is perfectly applicable to all three together. So then you'll notice that the Georgians established an interesting innovation of having half the cabinet of ministers coming and meeting their counterparts with all of the Commission, all the colleges of the European Commission. Okay, interesting development. I wonder if the others think about it as well. There have been, particularly on the Georgian side, there's been questions as to whether, if no membership perspective, should you try to exceed the European Economic Area. And we had a careful look at that, and Marius VAHL down there will speak ex cathedra on the subject in a moment, because he's the strategist of the European Economic Area. Basically, our feeling was the free movement of labour, that's the fourth freedom there. It's very, very difficult to imagine that the European Union, as party to the European Economic Area, would be willing to say, we waive, we do a derogation on the free movement of labour. After all of the very difficult Brexit negotiations and the sanctity of the four freedoms altogether, that doesn't look very plausible. For the rest, the approximation process, of course, can get, for the other three freedoms, can get closer and closer and all the way, in principle, to EEA conditions. But EEA full membership seems to us to be excluded for basically the free labour movement factor, because when wages are so low, still in the three, compared to the EU average, the risk of really damaging the brain drain is too serious. Now, Kubilus has proposed the trio, using the Berlin Plus analogy. I think people in Brussels and in the EU institutions are not terribly impressed by the progress of the Berlin Plus, and they're not sure whether it is such a beautiful brand name for the process. So let us say, I would put it on one side. I think the trio is a great name. Then the question is how, part of the trio proposition for Kubilius, and you'll see him, so you already have his paper, it's in circulation. I mean, it's partly about what I would call upgrading actions, and partly it's about the multilateralization of the three. So there the question would be how to proceed with the multilateralization of the three, a subject where I know, Olga, you must be thinking about. Well, strange to relate, but here we are in the Association Exchange Forum, which is remarkably close to the Kubelis idea for trilateralization. Of course, it's a civil society initiated and driven activity, but with official participation, whereas Kubelis was making a proposal that would be officially led. But here you have something, to my mind, that can be built on. Your Association Exchange Forum exists now for 3 years. It acquires a certain momentum and reputation. And this could see, as we were mentioning yesterday, one could imagine the three governments saying, we're going to meet together and discuss all these issues of common interest. You can do that in any case. You just have to decide to do it. And you've got to decide now whether you want to follow up on the idea which has been perfectly well described in the joint civil society declaration. But if you did this, you could do it, and this is in the tradition of all of this DCFTA and civil society business, you could do it alongside this civil society-led activity. I mean, you might imagine day one when the three governments are doing business together, and in day two you'd have something that would be opened up to people like those here present. And then this would go alongside, you gathered, I guess, most of you, that the day before yesterday, Kubilius, as a new MEP, you know he is former Lithuanian Prime Minister, but now he's an MEP. And one of the first moves, he's become chairperson of the Euronest parliamentary activity of the EAP. And in that capacity, he convened a meeting with a huge participation, about 200 people in the room, where Luke and I were both present the day before yesterday. So you've got a parliamentary mechanism already underway there that really sits very nicely alongside an intergovernmental trilateral. So that seems to be rather well set up. Now, my final remarks are on this wider Europe business. I mean, the term wider Europe is in the title for this panel, but then what do we mean by that? Well, this is going to be a long story of a decade or more, or some decades. But I would advance the argument that the EU's own internal constitutional debates and enlargement process, confusion and disagreements, all of this means that there is something to be done at the wider Europe level. When I say wider Europe, let us say by definition it is all of the non-EU member states who are seriously interested in European integration. That includes, of course, the 3 EEA cases, it includes the Balkans, includes the trio, and I guess it's going to include the Brexit UK if they can, in the end, decide what they want to do, but which is still undecided. And maybe Turkey, which is half in there with the customs union. Of course, the Erdogan politics is extremely difficult from an EU point of view, but there may be, at some point, a change there. So that's the geographic scope of what we're talking about, because all of these diverse groups are basically engaged in this same huge list of EU economic policy instruments based on the single market, but going beyond that. You've got 10 headings up here, and you will recognize all of them because the trio are in all of them. But I think the important point is to say that if you look at what the EEA countries are doing and what the Balkans are doing, or what the Balkans should next do, because their agreements are obsolete, the FAA agreements are obsolete, and what the UK may end up negotiating, this is the standard set of instruments. And several of them are applied identically to the whole of the wider Europe. I would say the Pan-Euromed rules of origin and Pan-European product standards are perfect examples where nobody is doing it differently or half differently. This is just a standard. All of these countries are in the visa-free business, let's say in the Energy Community Treaty has been extended from the Balkans through to the trio. There's the Transport Community Business, which has recently been initiated for the Balkans with comments on the text that, oh, this does not mean a president for the trio. Okay, we note that the official member states in question have said that, but it's pretty obvious that the transport dimension is something of quintessentially pan-European properties. So the idea of just having a transport community just for the Balkans doesn't look very sustainable in the future. Sorry. Okay, and this is my final comment on this wider Europe strategy of business. So what would it be, this wider Europe thing that we are talking about? Would it be a new treaty, a new community? Would it be a new institution? Well, here, for my part, I would say no. Don't go down that track. Follow rather the track of the EU global strategy, which exists. It's an important document, important conceptual document, policy related. Should last for several years. Why not have, and this is something I would commend to the next commission and next EAS commissioner, why not then complement the global strategy with a wider Europe strategy document, which would be a systematic policy statement linking to all of these instruments that I mentioned and presenting how some of them are applicable to the whole of the area, some of them with some differences. Basically, it would be a strategy designed to optimize the integration with the EU and standardize instruments where possible, but bearing in mind differences. And there's a specific point here on the Balkans. Now, it's not your problem here, but it is the big problem in Brussels since the refusal to gain unanimity for Northern Macedonia and Albanian accession candidate status. This has thrown the Balkan business into exceptional and really grave confusion. The question is, how does the EU get out of this between now and May of next year when, in their wisdom, the EU authorities have decided to have, under Croatian chairmanship of the Council, a double summit in Zagreb, and the morning summit will be for the Balkans, and the afternoon summit will be for the Eastern Partnership. So, right? No. Oh, you changed the plan. Okay, well, you tell me what the new plan is. But anyway, this is symbolically highlighting the need to have coherence between the two. And some would say, with respect to the Balkans, they need to catch up with the DCFTAs now and have new comprehensive agreements, just irrespective of the enlargement process, to bring them more up to date. Now, this leads to the final line here, reshaping of European architecture between avant-garde EU, basic EU, and wider Europe, where wider Europe gets increasingly closer to basic EU, a task for a decade or two, and maybe as that develops, it becomes easier for those in the wider Europe who want to accede to the EU to accede to the basic Europe. Now, this gets into the middle of the present extremely unsettled but fundamental debate or questioning in the EU and its member states itself as to how the EU is going to sort itself out as between those elements like Euro, Schengen, defense, which do not embrace all member states, but are the advance guard of the integration process on top of the single market business, which is common to all. So you can, let us say, at least in talking about it, we can say, okay, there's an avant-garde group there, and then there's everybody, including all the rest, who are in what one might call basic EU. It's the institutions and the single market. And then we notice that the wider Europe group, they are really getting close to, or very close to, the basic EU. And as the relationship and the content of the avant-garde group and the basic group changes over time, which is an ongoing debate, fundamental debate, then that changes the context, maybe for accession from wider Europe into basic Europe. Now, the key point here, I think, for the trio is within this wider Europe concept that is being discussed here, you're part of it. And you can see, you can understand how you are part of an ongoing dialectic, dynamic process. Nobody can predict exactly where it leads. There are not even proposals that are particularly clear. They're divergent proposals. But you can be part of that policy analytical, forward-looking process. And this, if you enter into this, if you like, in a very competent way on the basis of your experience and your highly qualified people, this is a far more productive way to embrace the big European question than to be hooked up still on the old membership perspective or not question. That, as of today, that debate is a dead end. But this wider Europe concept, which you belong to, you are co-owners of, I would suggest, this could be a far more productive way ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for this brilliant start of our panel with your presentation. Let me sum up by saying that it's very interesting to hear from your presentation that there is already a huge set of instruments our countries have to ensure deeper and more comprehensive integration with the European Union, but as far as I understand, you suggest to shape it properly in a more visionary concept. So it's very important to hear, and with this I'd like to proceed further with the discussion and give the floor to our next colleague represented in a panel. This is Daniel SZELIGOWSKI. He's the head of Eastern Partnership Europe program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And as far as I was informed, he's one of the major contributors to the report prepared by the Polish Institute for International Affairs, where the concept of the new vision of the Eastern Partnership after 2020 is presented. This sounds like a proposal for the new vision of Eastern Partnership, but really, if you're getting into the report, you can see that there is no a unified vision possible for these 6 countries. And by analyzing all the possible formats of integration without membership, you're giving also a lot of piece of analytics to EEA countries, to the Brexit issues, and also to latest developments in relations, for example, with Armenia and Azerbaijan. And you say that, I mean, your report says that further steps could be taken mostly in terms of sectoral integration in some specific sectors. What's your take on that? And maybe you can elaborate a bit on the previous presentation, whether it matches with the vision you presented. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, it's working. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. Actually, I will probably not go as much into details as Michael has just done. I mean, I'll like to start with some macro vision and then go into some specific questions, because I also think that Michael was very mild when he told about the current situation in the European Union. I had a privilege, or maybe it was not always a privilege, to take part in many discussions on the ongoing EAP negotiations in recent days with the French representatives, with the German representatives. So just saying that there is no political appetite for deepening, for strengthening the EAP, the Eastern Partnership, is like saying nothing. I mean, some of them, and I have to say that I'll always say the French representative, but I will not mention who the person was. He was so open to say, of course, behind closed doors. And when talking about Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, he told that we will never let them sit at the table together with us. So when the Polish representative asked about the sectoral integration, he told, no way, we can talk about sectoral cooperation. That's the maximum. So if these are circumstances in which we would like to talk about wider Europe, deepening, strengthening, updating, etc., I think that's not going to happen. At least that's not going to happen soon. Not going to happen in short and in midterm perspective. So there is no political appetite, maybe apart from few countries like Poland, Sweden, Romania, Baltic states, but that's all. I mean, that's maximum. So in this situation, probably what is possible, and this is what we propose in our report, this is still keeping the same structure of the EAP, but trying to stretch the boundaries a bit, at least to the extent that the EAP is still a house for 6 EAP countries, but some of them are more privileged than the others. So this is in practice a principle of differentiation. This exists as well in the European Union when we have the Schengen zone, the Euro area, where some countries are part of these groups and some are not. So and I think that actually the real struggle when we are talking about these negotiations on the new midterm vision of the EAP, the real struggle is not whether it could be achieved, I mean, if the EAP could be strengthened or deepened, but the real struggle is if we can secure those successes that have been achieved so far. So actually, to all of you who criticize the Eastern Partnership, I did it as well. Yeah, I was very vocal in pointing out different negative sides of the Eastern Partnership. I mean, the situation could be even worse soon, but I'm still an optimist. So speaking frankly, the Eastern Partnership has one very important added value, and this is keeping the 6 EAP countries on the EU agenda. So without this whole concept of the EAP, without this common house for 6 EAP countries, particular countries like Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, even Ukraine, they won't be as important on the EU agenda as they are at the moment, like it or not. I'm talking about the political level, not about the expert level. What they really say behind the closed doors is like stick to the EAP or probably bilateral relations would be very soon downgraded. And I'm talking about the midterm perspective because by midterm perspective I mean maximum 5 years, because the longer period is of course non-political period. Politicians live from one elections to the other, so they don't think about the period which goes more than 5 years. What we actually what we proposed is to have 3 pillars, 3 sectors, you call it whatever you like. And a political roof so this, it looks like a home. I don't have, unfortunately, any presentation, but you can imagine 3 pillars and a roof. So 3 pillars means 3 sectors that could be available for all 6 EAP countries, and the political roof is what we called rising political profile of relations with 3 associated countries, which in practice is the EAP plus or any other name. But I think that the rising political profile is more acceptable when looking at the situation from the perspective of different member states. It doesn't seem to be a completely new format. So what it could be, actually, we propose 3 different options. The first one is organizing additional meetings on a level of 4 ministers. This actually is acceptable to some member states, and I've recently even learned that This was proposed by the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, so probably this could be achieved very soon. The second option is participation of different ministers, foreign ministers or sectoral ministers in EU councils. Of course, under the condition that there is a discussion which will not end up with any decision regarding this particular state or any statement. In this situation, probably these ministers could not take part in the discussion. And then this also means the third option is involvement of different EAP officials in working groups within the European Commission. This is actually an option, as far as I remember, available to the European Economic Area states at the moment. And this is, in practice, means a principle of differentiation. So this is like saying to the associated countries that we really acknowledge your reform progress, and we don't leave you alone. We don't put you aside. The other important aspect is that this format is still available to all, to the rest free countries if they have political will to foster closer relations with the European Union. This option would be open for them in future, so we don't exclude them at the very beginning. The second thing, still under this political roof, under this higher political profile, is creating some DCFTA roadmaps for free associated countries, because there are different documents. Actually, no one knows, or maybe very few people know which of them is the most important document, which is the main point of reference. So we propose to create a DCFTA roadmaps, which would enable actually to better prioritize these actions taken by free associated countries. Here is a negative side of that. This would probably put bigger pressure on the free governments, because this would hold them more accountable. So probably this could, of course, be accomplished by some additional financial instrument which would help them implementing these roadmaps. And the third thing, the third option, is to help free associated countries cooperate between themselves. So this is a trilateral format. As an example, free associated countries, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, could take some example of Visegrad group. So as informal cooperation, the level of prime minister, the level of foreign ministers, there could be even parliamentary cooperation. The problem is that this, I think that's my personal opinion, this cooperation between free AA states didn't fly. I mean, at least up until this moment. You can imagine that within these negotiations about a new midterm vision for the EAP countries, free AA countries would come up with some joint proposal, but we know that some of them, I will not point out which of them, but we know that some of them put their own proposals, although of course there were negotiations between all three of them. So this is like a dual track approach, and this is not understandable to me. I mean, why? This means that probably this joint interest is not there, is not in place. And the other thing is, like Michael mentioned this, there was a proposal, this was a proposal from Polish Foreign Minister Waszczykowski to establish a rotating presidency of the EAP. It was actually turned out by Ukrainian representatives, saying that there is not much that we can talk about with Belarus, with Azerbaijan, etc. But you all can imagine that, of course, Polish representatives are not always happy with there is a rotating presidency of, I don't know, any other country. Like this, I mean, this is the kind of socialization that the EAP countries need to take into account. So yeah, I mean, this is like being in the European Union, that others sometimes decide for you. So this is the same situation within the Eastern Partnership, like it or not. So this is about that's all actually about this special offer for free associated countries. But saying about these three pillars, so three sectors which could be available to all of 6 EAP countries, we mentioned three. This is economy, this is security, and this is human dimension. This is in line with this better prioritizing, choosing different sectors that here the prospects are probably the most obvious to achieve. We point out to development of infrastructure. Michael mentioned this as well. The problem with infrastructure, shortage of infrastructure in the region, is that of course it hampers the inflow of FDIs, and you can solve this question by really different means. We proposed three. The first one is the extension of the European Investment Bank mandate to the EAP countries. The second one is establishing a kind of special trust fund, and the third option is actually creating kind of new intergovernmental special fund in which you can mix financing from EU, from different international organizations and private funds to build infrastructure in the region. This is important from the point of view of EU countries as well, EU investors who would like to put their money in the EAP countries. They would use this infrastructure, and of course from the perspective of EAP countries, bulk of their export goes to the European Union, so this infrastructure would be used actually to foster trade ties with the European Union. The next option is to help the EU countries better absorb the funds that are available at the moment, because as you probably remember, there are many funds that are available to EAP countries on the accounts of different international banks, different international organizations that are not used because of small, I would say, institutional capacity on behalf of the EAP countries. Here it was even the proposal, I remember Minister Klimkin asking about helping Ukrainian regions developing project proposals, implementing this project, etc. So this is one of the options that are available. The second pillar, which is security, of course, we all know that the European Union cannot extend hard security guarantees to the EAP countries, nothing like the Article 5 of NATO and even security guarantees of the European Union itself. So we talk about soft security, which is fighting Russian propaganda, fighting hybrid threats. This is actually a very interesting case, because when it comes to these hybrid threats and fighting propaganda, all 6 EAP countries, even including Belarus, they are eager to cooperate with the European Union in this regard. So even Belarus would like to see more EU engagement in fighting Russian propaganda, which is interesting, and I think we should take advantage of that. I mean, foster cooperation with Belarus in this regard. When it comes to combating hybrid threats, there are different options. I mean, we can, talking about the European Union, we can extend some agencies, some organizations, regulatory framework to EAP countries if there is only a political will on both sides. And the third pillar, which we call partnership for citizens, we think this is really very important. One of the options, this is not new actually, this is reducing roaming between EAP countries and between EAP states and the European Union, but here the problem is that the European Commission, the European Union has no capacity in this regard. So what the European Commission can do is actually to help all 6 EAP countries negotiate with private contractors. So that's all. I mean, if they team up together as 6 EAP countries together with the European Commission, they can put more pressure on private contractors, but this is maximum what we can do. Although I personally believe that the question of reducing roaming charges is extremely important, especially here in Ukraine, when you take into account that many of Ukrainians are living in Poland at the moment, and of course the cost of this calls is horrendous, tremendous really. The next thing is developing digital infrastructure, digital services in different sectors like health, public procurement, trade, etc. Developing e-administration, although of course even in different sectors one may say that the European Union could learn from Ukraine and from different EAP countries, not the other way around. The next thing is enhancing mobility and youth programs. This is, of course, taking into account the program Erasmus, and which at the moment groups all other countries, all other programs. And this is also concluding agreements between the EAP states and the EAP countries on the free movement of qualified professionals. But we really understand that this is a very controversial issue for different EU member states, so this probably would be very hard to achieve. The last thing is strengthening small and local NGOs. So what we think is important is to go regional in the EAP countries, not only focus on capitals like Kyiv, Chisinau, Tbilisi, because of course the ideal option would be if you can meet just a person on the street of, I don't know, Vinnytsia or Batumi, and you ask them about the EAP, what the Eastern Partnership is about, and they can mention just one thing, like, let's say, visa-free regime or the association agreement. So that would be still something, that they know what the EAP is about and the EU communication policy in these regions work. But that's not the case, at least not at the moment. So the different possible options are, of course, increasing financing for regional small NGOs, increasing the funds for re-granting, but probably there's some regulations in this regard could be changed. And the horizontal issue that we propose is to actually link some funds for the civil society with the regime that exists in a particular country. So if there is an authoritarian regime, for example, you can limit funds that are granted to the government and actually redirect them to the civil society, because at the moment there's a situation where the European Commission can withdraw the money and, for example, redirect it to a completely different region, let's say from Belarus to Morocco. Probably with this last proposal, I would like to finish this specific part. But before I end up, I would like to just mention or conclude with one remark in regard to wider Europe proposal. This is probably that's gonna be very Polish statement. As you know, Poles very like to complain about everything, so I would like to complain as well. I mean, the words really matter, and words create reality. So why I don't like the term wider Europe? Because there is a wider Europe. Of course, this begs the question if there is a kind of narrow Europe. So there is a Europe, first-class Europe and the second-class Europe. We, of course, fight. We have fought for many years in Poland. We've tried to counter this narrative, this rhetoric of old Europe, of old member states and new member states. Sometimes it flies, sometimes it doesn't fly. So I think for EAP countries as well, that should be very important to say that actually there is one whole Europe, and then the Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova are part of this Europe. Yes, there is European Union, there are European aspirations, but still the Europe is one, whole, and free. And with this note, I would like to end up. And thank you very much once again for having me here.
Thank you, Daniel, for this presentation. Our panel, I think, is very much filled with a lot of messages and suggestions, and it's very interesting for me to notice that while Michael concentrated in his presentation on the real vision of possible de facto integration as it is of our three countries, Daniel already focused on the formats which might be applied to this. It would be interesting to hear what our discussion would lead us to, but I would also underline that most of the discussion we heard so far concentrated on the necessity for the European Union to form this vision, to shape this vision based already on instruments we have here. And it's a great pleasure for me to say that we have Taras Kachka, who has perfectly integrated into our panel. He is the Deputy Minister for Economic Development and Trade representative of Ukraine. We were focusing on a very political and interesting discussion. What should be the format of our future cooperation with the European Union, something between membership and what we have right now. But still we're in the process of understanding who should be his stakeholder and who should form the request for such unified format for TRIO. This should be shaped by the European Commission. The demand should come from our countries, whether it's ourselves, I mean Georgia, Moldova and Ukraine, who shall suggest the format. And what's, to your opinion, the role of actual business and trade in all of these discussions? The floor is yours.
Thank you. My apologies for being late, and apologies as well that during recent weeks I was rather aggressive in terms of definition of what we want and request from the European Union, and some of you suffered personally on this, and I think that my apologies also to Luke. Yeah, no problem. I think that my intentions in any of my statements are, in any case, constructive and positive, and I really like and love the EU. And I believe that in reality we are moving in good direction, but in order to understand why I am so sometimes critical about what we are discussing, and maybe definitely aggressive in certain assessment, is that we are living through the period of, let's say, rational understanding of what we can achieve and what can be achieved. And this rationality is definitely positive development in our relations. So that I think that what is difficult today is to talk in concepts, because concepts are not surviving. The concept of membership is definitely not on agenda. The concept of cooperation versus integration, these concepts are too abstract, and sometimes they are assessed in hostile manner by either member states or parties, ruling parties, opposition parties in different states, in Ukraine and member states as well. So some of them want integration, others cooperation. But when you ask what in reality, what you input, what is your input into this concept of integration or cooperation, you understand that this is rather abstract approach. Because in reality, in practices, we see a lot of challenges which we need to overcome. And the examples of these challenges are quite clear, so that we can use the examples of what we have on our current agenda. For example, integration in gas market. So that integration in gas market, what I always promoted, that we need to have the same rights and obligations as member states in the European Union. I can explain, use the model of European Economic Area, Swiss agreements, examples of Annex 17 of Association Agreement, a lot of examples. But what we did, we updated Annex 27 on energy, introduced new provisions. It works quite well, but I late to this panel because I spent morning with Prime Minister and members of cabinet who are responsible for energy, and among other things we discussed how to implement this Annex 27. And it is, so we actually requested this annex as a roadmap to integration, and now we see on our side challenges on how to do this. The same problems exist on Commission side, on member state side as well. Next big thing, ACA, ACA. So that ACA, so we did a lot. Okay, so one thing is to convince Commission to send formal assessment missions, the different assessment, whether we are ready or not ready. This is part of our conversation with European Commission. But at the same time, what I see is that Ukraine invested a lot, successfully or unsuccessfully, this is another thing, invest a lot into development of relevant legislation. We have EU style, in brackets or not, so that EU-based legislation on technical regulation. And now what we see is that companies from the EU importing stuff or products from the EU to Ukraine, they say that why we should go through the similar procedure. And this is a problem for us. And they address this problem to me, to Ministry of Economy. And we see that long-term encouragement of European Commission to develop our legislation on technical regulations in line with EU now creates certain obstacles to our trade. That's why we need this ACA agreement, not only because we want this, because this is a part of integration or something like that, but in order to meet the challenges of our trade. Another example, which is I think the most controversial, and we have a different point of view and assessment with Luke last time we met. So this agreement on poultry. So that I was really critical about this, but I'm happy that I believe that it will be ratified as soon as possible by Parliament. President will submit this agreement today to Parliament, and we will ratify it. And why this agreement is important in terms of integration? Because what we see now is that we opened open trade, our bilateral trade, and it led to distortion on the EU market. And the problem which was created by Ukrainian poultry is actual, so you cannot say that it is artificial. The effect of trade was actually led to distortion. And we need to face this distortion. So whether both sides are satisfied, both sides are satisfied. But the question is how we shall treat these kind of distortions in situations when we have similar legislation as in the European Union. We have the same food safety legislation. We have strong cooperation between entities. And the question whether we should treat Ukraine and the European Union as competing markets or as markets which in long term will be integrated. And this is the core, let's say, underlying question under our discussions, because we can find a solution on any topic on our agenda, but the question, what is the long-term strategy? Because this long-term strategy is defined by key political promises of both sides. And key political promise of European Union and Eastern Partnership is that no membership but economic integration. And that's why we need to think how to implement this long-term strategy from point of view of actual problems we have now. Actual, not problems, actual items on our agenda. Because this number of these items are more than I described. The list of topics we will discuss next week on Association Committee and Trade Composition is extremely long. But the question is, underlying question is how to meet actual questions on our agenda and long-term strategy. And this is a challenge for all of us, and I think that in any case, the actual solutions for every particular problem which we have now is moving us closer to integration than to competition. Sometimes it's painful, it requires a lot of really hot debates, and sometimes with some angry positions, but in reality we are moving in positive direction. And I'm really glad that all of you have patience, yes, to do these debates and in working through and resolving all these day-to-day problems in order to move into closer and closer to integration. What I certainly do not support is the idea that we will have a political solution, political concept, so that someone on highest level will describe in non-paper how we shall proceed with particular problems. So that's why I think that our strategy should be experience-based on how we dealt with previous issues on our agenda. So this is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Taras. It really shows that Ukrainian government have a very, very pragmatic approach towards its relations with the European Union at all levels, and it perfectly leads us to the next speaker of our panel, Marius, who is head of EEA policy coordination at the European Free Trade Association Secretariat. So basically, this is one of the great examples of de facto integration of the number of European countries in this continent with the European Union. And we were discussing that basically now we can see that there is an EFTA, there is a Secretariat, there is a huge number of branches of institutions established around implementation of this agreement in the specific countries at the level of Secretariat of the EFTA, at the EES and European Commission. But this took you quite a number of years of work to establish this structure, and this is basically where we see ourselves as a country now, because we're somewhere in the middle between beginning of joining and uniting our economies and integration into EU single market. But to my opinion, it very much lies to this approach very much lies to what Taras have already elaborated on. But your countries were in a bit of more favorable position, because you from the very beginning were treated as a natural partners, where European Union had to find this solution, which is not the case for our countries so far. So the floor is yours. We're really looking forward for your presentation and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm going to try to briefly sketch out for you what the EEA agreement actually is and how it kind of works in practice. So the agreement, it provides for the participation of 3 rather small Western European states, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway, in the internal market of the EU. So that is the EEA. Using a bit jargon that you are familiar with, I think it's safe to say this is the deepest agreement the EU has ever concluded with any countries outside the European Union. It's probably not the most comprehensive. I think your association agreements beat us on that, but it's putting it in context. Our member states, they have dozens of agreements, arrangements and dialogues with the European Union. They're part of the Schengen area, lots of justice and home affairs cooperation, part of the foreign security and defense cooperation they're doing. All of these multilateral conventions and treaties that Michael's mentioned, where our member states are part of all of them. They're in NATO, they're in the Council of Europe, they're in Arctic Council, in the Nordic Council, in the Council of Baltic Sea States, etc., etc. So if it's possible to be in it, they're in it. So overall, it has a very, very deep and close relationship across all policy areas for our member states. But I'm going to focus on the EEA, and I think in your context, the relevant comparison is the DCFTA parts of the agreements, and not the agreements as such. I don't know if any of you, most of you have probably done the mistake of trying to print out your association agreements, which is a massive thing. And if you look at then the EEA agreement, it's quite a slim little thing, and you might not think this is not that impressive. But then you would be mistaken, because to the EEA agreement there are 22 annexes, and within those annexes they contain 6,500 legal acts. And if you really want to try to print it out, I don't think anybody ever does. Nobody has ever read the whole thing. It's probably about 50,000 pages. So it's a pretty deep and comprehensive agreement. And I think a very important part to realize, this is, I mean, it's much more than a free trade agreement. It's not about market access only and these things, but it's an agreement that actually establishes a common legal order of these 31 countries, so the EU and these three EFTA states. It's a common homogeneous legal EEA EFTA states, is what we're calling those in EFTA who are in the EEA, so the 31 countries of the EEA. And on the basis of having this common legal order, so it's not a question of us having access to a system, it's actually we are part of the same system. So it's an important difference. And on the basis of this common legal order of 6,500 legal acts right now, we have the full 4 freedoms, just like like you have in the EU. And an important element of this, it's not just kind of about state-to-state relations, it is actually confers significant rights upon the citizens of the EFTA states. Like myself, I'm Norwegian, so I have, like Luke and Michael and Daniel, I have same rights to travel, to live, to work, to study, and to retire anywhere in these 31 countries. So the main difference between me and them is that they can vote for the European Parliament elections, and I cannot because I'm not a citizen of the EU. But for any other purposes of my daily life, I have exactly the same rights and opportunities and freedoms as they do. So it's kind of a big deal. And from the perspective of our economic operators, it's basically the same. They are treated in the same way as EU businesses. There are some differences there because we are not part of the customs union. The EEA is not a customs union, so we have customs procedures for certain things, but when it comes to all of the regulatory aspects, it's exactly the same for investments, for buying and selling and everything. And we have some special arrangements for fisheries and agriculture, but I'm not going to go into that right now. So this is the core of the EEA, but the EEA also goes beyond that because it also allows for our participation in EU programs and EU agencies. So, and this has been going on for decades, even before the EEA. We're part of the Horizon, Erasmus, Connecting Europe, Creative Europe, etc., etc. I think there's about 14 programs right now. And all of the growing number of EU agencies, I counted 21 last time, where our representatives or our citizens can participate on the same terms as, as those of the EU, but in the decision-making bodies, we do not have a vote. We participate, but do not have a vote. Another important element of the EEA is that we have our own EEA cohesion policy. I mean, our member states are wealthier than the EU average, and we have a financial mechanism whereby we contribute to reducing social and economic inequalities. So we're providing a lot of assistance to especially the Central and Eastern European states, to Poland and Romania, etc., etc. Part of this is that being very closely integrated is, of course, that we also have mechanisms for dialogue and for our officials and experts to actually participate in the development of this internal market. So experts and officials from our national administrations, they participate in developing the internal market, just like the experts from the EU member states in all of these hundreds of committees that assist the Commission when they are developing their new legislation, in all of the committees that are developing the EU programs, etc. To manage this, we have quite a complex and structure which is quite different from what you have in your agreements. To make sure that our member states actually live up to their obligations and implement all of these rules, we have an independent surveillance authority, the EFTA Surveillance Authority, who monitors and inspects our member states in a similar way that the Commission does in the EU member states to make sure they actually live up to the obligations. And we also have a separate court, so where our member states and or economic operators can be brought to court if they are seen to be acting in breach of this agreement, and you have binding decisions there. So it's a system which is kind of called a two-pillar system, so you have institutions which are quite mirrors what the EU institutions, the Commission and the courts are doing there. We have a similar system on our side. And just final to describing the system, we are of course 3 countries on our side. So, and when we're making all of these decisions on legal acts and these things, our 3 member states, they need to agree. This is relevant when you're talking about trio. You might not want to go that far. So in order to make a new legal act applicable in the EEA, Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein have to agree. So that is we have a very complex system of 30 working groups and 5 subcommittees to make sure that works. And as was mentioned there earlier, this has been going on for 25 years. We're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the EEA this year. And it functions very well. All of these institutions I mentioned, they have been established and they function very well. And we are able to keep up to date, more or less, with all of the developments of the new EU legislation. I mean, I told you that there are 6,500 legal acts, roughly, in the package. And every year we revise or introduce revised or new EU legislation into the agreement. And that's what I'm doing. We have a joint committee that meets about 8 times a year, where we make decisions on amending the EEA agreement. So far this year, I can give you the number, 599 legal acts have been incorporated into the EEA agreement. So revising, I guess, a couple of thousand of these pages. And if you think that it's managed to keep like this for 25 years, it's quite impressive, because since in that period, I mean, this was based on the Treaty of Rome and the European Community of 12 member states. We've had 4 treaty reforms, and we have 4 enlargements, but still the EEA agreement kind of keeps ticking on. And keeps working actually very, very well these days. Just end with a couple of the challenges. The one is the obvious political one. We are part of a system where we are not part of the decision-making process. So there's a democratic deficit there, which is inherent in the agreement. We are consulted, but we're not part of the decision-making. I mean, this was based on a political compromise in our member states, where we're divided half and half, both those who want membership and those who do not want. And this was the compromise that was possible for our member states, and this was acceptable to the EU, and the system works well. And as I said, for citizens and economic operators, yeah, I get most of the benefits of EU membership. so that's, but there's a political, there's a clear, I mean, democratic deficit on our side. We do spend quite a lot of time adjusting the agreement to all of these structural changes in the EU. They're developing all of these new regulatory agencies. How do we fit this into our structure when they're starting to revise all of these things? The political changes with treaty changes, suddenly the European Parliament are gradually become much more important. How should we accommodate that and these things? But we manage. But I mean, it's a lot of work, and it's quite difficult. And on the more legal procedural issues, I mean, we bring in all of this new acquis. They never stop. They keep making new and revising new legislation for the internal market. And there are always some delays for us and how to do it. So we're always trying to beat the clock, because if we wait too long, you will no longer have a level playing field, which is what our citizens and our economic operators depend upon and base all of their plans on. So we have to kind of try to keep up, and that is, it's quite a big job. And that job mainly falls on us. I mean, the EU, they have already been doing this, making their own internal market, and the adjustments that we need to make, it is very much up to us to make sure that this works. So it requires quite a lot of resources and expertise, not just in our administrations and for our experts, not just kind of keeping up and making all of this being part of the agreement, but in our member states and in administrations to make sure it is implemented properly. So, I mean, I know our embassies in Brussels are the biggest of our member states they have in the world, because they need to do this. In addition, they have the help of us in the Secretariat. We're 60 people doing this full time. We have the Surveillance Authority. There are 80 people working full time. We have this Financial Mechanism Office dealing with that. That's another 80 people. So just from a, you know, public sector kind of approach, it's a huge machinery, and the requirements to make sure that this works are really, 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 really high in terms of both speed and accuracy and legal expertise. But as I said, and we also have a current continuous challenge, since that most people don't actually know that much about the EEA. So kind of making sure, even, I mean, it goes for in our member states, even in our administrations, in the EU administration, what people are not, it's 25 years old, so keeping people up to date and making sure that they're aware that we are there and that we have these rights and obligations we spend a lot of time doing that. But I have to say, I mean, it functions very, very well, and our cooperation these days, I've been doing this for 10 years, and with the EU, with Luke's counterparts, Angelina and the others, it's functioning very, very, very well. And in terms of our domestic politics, it is probably more popular than it has ever been. I mean, the idea of membership, which is kind of an option for us, my fellow citizens, they don't want that, but people are very happy with the EEA. I mean, in general, there are always people who either want more or less, but overall it has a very broad public support. So I think it's going to be with us for a very long time. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marius. And Thank you very much for this presentation. As far as I understand, it's the first time when we engage or involve people from EEA or EFTA to our discussion related to European integration, which brings a much wider context to this discussion. And without bringing back our discussion to membership or not, it's clear for Ukraine where we could be standing in 25 years, at least if we will not have this perspective. Because we started already so far with this approach, and as Taras was mentioning, the Annex 27, it's something about trade in goods, and we're discussing the digital annex, which is about services. So, and we already enjoying the visa-free liberalization. That's why it's extremely great decision for our panel to invite as a concluding speaker Luc DEVIGNE, who is the Director for Russia, Eastern Partnerships, Central Asia and OSCE, and Deputy Managing Director for Europe and Central Asia of the European External Action Service from Brussels. Of course, your profile, Luc, covers much more geographically, much more geographically involved countries than only those represented here and covered by this discussion. So you, as a person accumulating all of our wishes, needs and requests, are mostly welcome to take the floor and elaborate on your vision on that.
Thank you very much, Olga, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Pleasure to be here and to travel from Brussels for this event, because I think it's important that we get as many exchanges, possibilities as possible. And first of all, Olga, I want to thank you for your past work in your previous capacity. I think you did a great job when you were Director General with the Ukraine administration. I had the pleasure to have a number of meetings and to co-chair committees with you. And I think you did it well. So I wish you the best in your future career. It's good to be here to discuss Eastern Partnership, of course, at a time when we are widely consulting the future of Eastern Partnership. And I think this needs also to be underlined, that the EU cannot be accused of doing this policy, you know, in an ivory tower kind of attitude. I mean, we received more than 200 contributions. And I want to thank also those who contribute, including those who are on the panel, because, of course, there's always more ideas in more heads than in one, or even if that one is composed of 28, at least, plus the institution. So, but what I want to say first for the foremost, because I heard, of course, some more or less contentious issues, that one, there is unity in the EU continue supporting Eastern Partnership policy. And even what you would say, or what you would think are the least enthusiastic member states all confirm this. And I think it's important. And the second aspect of this is that the unity is important. And if we want to keep this unity, we have to be a bit smart, avoiding certain areas. I think that the debate whether Eastern Partnership is a substitute or should be close to membership policy, comparing with the Western Balkans, who unfortunately, as you know, has not been a success at the latest summit, I don't think it's a good idea, because I think we're going to at least enter the same division on other topics, and for basically no reasons. Because Eastern Partnership, I think, is a success. And if you look at it from 10 years backwards, if you look at the achievement, be it economic achievement, but also for the people, not only the visa, but Erasmus Plus, I mean, all these positive things, the number of SMEs which have been funded, the number of thousands of jobs which have been created, all this is extremely positive. And it's always like that, of course, like journalists do not speak about train arriving on time, we don't speak perhaps enough of our success, and we focus on what goes wrong. Some mention road transport, some mention ACA, etc. I'll come to that in a second. So I think this is important. However, there is one area where there's been less success, or sometimes no success, and that's rule of law and good governance. And that, I'm afraid, is not the EU's fault. As I often say, Eastern Partnership policy is not colonization of countries. It's not a substitute for good governance. Good governance can only come from inside the countries. say this in Ukraine, where there is a very vibrant civil society, which is extremely important and extremely important to support it, and that we do. But at the end of the day, we don't vote. We do not appoint the officials. We do not appoint the judges, very importantly. And I don't think it's by coincidence that the Moldovan government falls on issues like appointment prosecutor general, and it's very sad, very unfortunate. And it's not us who decide or not to prosecute bank frauds. Where are the people who stole 5.5 billion from private bank in this country? Are they in jail? Are they prosecuted? No. In Moldova, Mr. Shore, appeal keeps being postponed since months and months under fallacious pretexts. These things we cannot remedy. And these type of failures are extremely detrimental to both the EU, because those who are against the Eastern Partnership policy, for wrong reasons I think, but they are against, will say that it's the EU's fault if this happens, and they will find sometimes a favorable echo. And so, and it's penalizing the people of Eastern Partners countries, and I think it's very sad. So we have to be aware of this. We will never, I think, sufficiently mention this as a precondition also to continue buying the EU unity. I was mentioning there is EU unity, but inside the EU you also have various political voices. If you follow the European Parliament debate, or within certain member states, certain politicians who are critical of this policy because they attribute this policy to a degradation of relation with Russia or whatever. Wrongly, I think, but this is the political reality. And so if we are failing in good governance and rule of law, collectively, if I can say so, because there are things which are not happening as they should in Eastern partner countries, we give arguments, we give leverage, and eventually we risk breaking EU unity, because more and more, of course, politicians or citizens will say, well, why should I pay, why should I support Ukraine or other countries if they themselves do not prosecute when money is stolen from them, their own state? Why should I compensate? And that's a fair question. But coming back to the future of Eastern Partnership, of course, is a policy. Policy doesn't make into a vacuum. And we have focused since the last summit, the 20 deliverables for 2020, on people, on citizen, which is very good. And by the way, very etymological. You all know that policy comes from, anybody knows policy? Where does policy come from? The word policy. Police, meaning city, and citizen comes from city. So a policy for citizen is only logical. And it's very good that we go back to these fundamentals. And I think we did great achievement in these last 3 years. Now, where does this take us for the next? I think we should continue on focusing on tangible benefits for citizens, clearly. We should also, obviously, because we're the EU and Eastern Partnership is part of our own policy, include our own priorities. You have all heard President-elect von der Leyen mentioning digital, mentioning green, climate action, etc. Well, green is a bit wider than climate. It's also environment and waste and a number of things. I think these are going to be very important topic and very highlighted for the future, I suspect. Obviously, not for me to decide. By the way, digital is also extremely interesting in fighting corruption. When you digitalize an economy, it's very difficult because to continue corruption, because corruption is based on cash, and digital reduces the use of cash. And there are good examples, by the way, of this. Thinking of Azerbaijan, they have developed this AZAN system, or centers where you can have all your formalities from getting a driving license to getting married through exclusively digital means, and there's no cash in these offices. It is quite a success, and there are other examples. In Ukraine also, there have been success in public procurement. I'm thinking of Prozoro. So don't get me wrong when I said there are big deficiencies in the rule of law. It's because of certain big cases, but I do think that there's been tremendous progress on many different fields. The problem is that when you have a big case, it's like, you know, overshadowing other things. So Eastern Partnership is not in a vacuum. European Commission policy will be important. Our member states as well. Politics, obviously, and all the political environment from Minsk agreement to many other aspects will be important, and I want to underline that in the EU there is a constant support, and you know it's our top priority to have the Minsk agreement being fully implemented, and we are recently encouraged by progress in this regard, but we are far from being done. I think also that the debate that I heard, and I had Michael mentioning, but you know, the political regime of Azerbaijan and Belarus, these are your words, are so different that, etc. We should not put them together. I think we should nuance the importantly here, because a country like Georgia is extremely dependent economically on relations with Azerbaijan. And Armenia, of course, depends on Georgia on its way to Russia for its own trading. So there are geographical, economical constraints. And these countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, I'll come to Belarus in a second, are also very interested in developing relations with the EU. Armenia had its own, if I can say so, tailor-made agreement after they decided to say no to the beautiful association agreement which had been brilliantly negotiated. And Azerbaijan has its own negotiation. So yes, they don't have the same ambition, they don't have the political line, but they also want, if you want, a tailor-made, improved relation with the EU, to use a very generic vocabulary. And we can deliver this, and this is good. And this is why differentiation, inclusiveness, I think these are sometimes a bit academic debates. Same for Belarus. Belarus is very much demandeur to have better relations with the EU. I mean, they keep saying it, and we don't have a negotiating framework. We have a coordination group that's indeed improving the relations. So Belarus also, and despite where they are in Eurasian Union, their relation with Russia played a positive role when Moldovans and Ukrainians were unjustly punished by Russia for having dared to sign the association agreement, DCFTA. Belarus didn't abide, they didn't follow this type of sanctions. And so there are, even if they have completely different political views, it's important to keep all six, I think, on board, but to allow for differentiation. Now, how can this differentiation happen? I think there are many ideas out there, and I'm very happy, first of all, that I heard what the EA was, because if you think that the DCFTA is big, look at EEA. But the DCFTA, the beauty, if I can say so, of DCFTA is that it allows for a commonly agreed dynamic, but not a compulsory approximation. EEA is compulsory systematic approximation. That's a huge work. You have to keep up with this big machine called the EU. It's already a challenge for rich countries like Norway, but imagine for countries who have a less developed administration. And already today, the DCFTA allows also to change these annexes to association council decisions. And I think it's good because it means we can decide with you, not impose. Again, we do not impose. With you, where do you want to change? We can advise you where we think it would be the most beneficial, but at the end of the day, it's the decision of the Eastern partners. And I think that's a very good system, and that's a system with very big potential. So there are other ideas. Prime Minister Kubilius yesterday in the European Parliament, and I suspect here as well, when he will come here today, tomorrow he told me as well, will highlight his own papers. They're very interesting. Daniel has his own paper. The Polish Institute has a very good ideas. So there are plenty of things we can do from a pragmatic point of view without changing the association agreement itself, because that is a new negotiation will trigger questions why, and we'll get into complications which are not needed, Similarly, road transport, a word on road transport, you say it's suffocating trade. These are your words. Well, I would tell you that road is not the only way to do trade, first of all. And secondly, I think that all we do in terms of developing infrastructures, but also what we've done in customs cooperation is much more important than, I don't know, giving 1 or 2 licenses for road transport. ACA, I think, is a bit of a unicorn, in the sense that ACA exists, but do you know how many ACAs there are in the world between the EU, with the EU? Taras, you know the answer.
Formally one, but
no, there's not formal or informal. ACA is a legal instrument. There is or there is not. There is one. Israel, not exactly the largest trading partner of the EU. So, does this mean that the EU or the trading partners of the EU cannot trade with the EU without an ACA? Of course not. So I'm not saying there are no benefits at all, but I think you shoot yourself a bit in the foot if you inflate the topic. Like, because you create an expectation, and also you create, if it doesn't happen, and it's not going to happen easily. And by the way, governance plays a very important role as well, very important.
do you remember when
And ACA was not promised. Well, you can read out the association article agreement about ACA. I know exactly what is in there, so, and you know why I know. So, but because you put yourself in a difficult position, because if you don't get your ACA, then it looks like you failed. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the success of Ukraine and the trading relation of Ukraine with the EU is a success. I hope that you will not disagree with that. Has happened without an ACA. And so, anyway, I'm not saying we're not going to get there. I'm saying governance is an issue. I'm saying that you shouldn't overplay the importance of it. And I'm definitely saying it's not been promised. There are conditions. So to conclude, because maybe you want to have a debate or to have questions, there is this English saying, if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? If I'm not mistaken, Michael. Well, I would think a bit for the Eastern Partnership policy. There are things that can be improved. There's a consultation process which is ongoing. It has all the ingredients to lead us to a summit, Zagreb, but probably more Brussels, but it's a decision for the President of the European Council. And by the way, I don't think it's a bad idea if these summits are separated, because these are different political environment, different political dynamics, and they should not be confused. And I think that with the contributions of, well, the panelists, but also you, civil society, we have all the elements to come to a successful summit in May 2021, and that's what I hope. And I'm pretty sure that the EU will remain united and committed to this policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Luc. With this final remarks, we conclude the formal part of our panel, and still we have not much, but still some room for questions. So, dear participants, you are mostly welcome to give your address to the panelists. Please, Luba Akulenko.
My name is Luba Akulenko. I am Executive Director of Ukrainian NGO, Ukrainian Center for European Policy, and I have 2 questions to Michael Everson and to Luc DEVIGNE. Mr. Emerson, in your speech you mentioned that there are some sectors that are very expensive for Ukraine in terms of implementation. You mentioned transport and ecology. And could you please share with us information? Do you have some basic data that provided you a possibility to count and to say us, since now we are speaking using assumptions that potentially transport, to make reforms in transport, it is very costly, but maybe you made some analysis that have some figures on base of Ukraine or maybe on base of other countries. if it is possible, I would be very grateful if you can share with us this information. And a question to Mr. DEVIGNE is speaking about ACA. I am a person who is positively lobbying association agreement in Ukraine for the last 5 years. And if you do not have membership perspective, you should look for some positive motivators. Easy access to EU market is one of the strongest motivators that can help our government to change legislation. By the way, according to our monitoring reports that we are making independently, technical regulation is one of the sectors where Ukraine is demonstrating good results. And if to be very honest, we should remember that if we have sectors where we are demonstrating good results, but we cannot receive a carrot in terms of ACA, how we will speak with other stakeholders in other sectors where they are not motivated? So what will be your answer? If you do not provide ACA for us, it will be not like a catastrophe, but our discourse will be ruined. Since now we are speaking, guys, we should change this. Please do not block the legislation process. At the end, you will receive a possibility to have ACA. But without it, we just do not know what to sell to our stakeholders and to our business. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Luke, can you be the first to answer?
Me? Yes. Okay. Sure, no problem.
I will repeat it.
A few things here. Technical regulation, and I agree with you, Ukraine is very advanced, is something, first of all, you should do for your own good. Like most of the reforms. Don't do it because of the EU. Technical regulations of the EU are usually the ones that are worldwide standards because of the size of the economy or as an exporter, because we are founding members or our member states are founding members of all international standardization organizations, etc., etc. So by relying on this, it's not only market access for EU market, it's also market access worldwide, etc. And it's basically integrating yourself into this international value chain. So now, and you should tell also the industries that these are the first goals. If you transform with an obsession about an ACA, again, there's only one country that has it. What do all the countries in the world do when they develop their trade with the EU without an ACA? And so I don't know for what reason in Ukraine suddenly this is gaining a huge traction. I think more for symbolic reasons, if you ask me, than for actual economic reasons. Because otherwise we would have a queue of third countries begging, asking, whatever in ACA. Have you seen any other third country doing that? No. So I think there's a bit of, I don't know, misunderstanding what it is. And last but not least, ACA means basically you fully entrust the authorities, the certifying authorities of a third country without further verification, yeah? So it's very linked to governance. And as long as, I'm sorry to say, and I'm going to be a bit blunt, as long as you have billions disappearing which are not prosecuted criminally, how do you expect to make believe to the EU that for smaller amounts there will be strict prosecution, there will be no corruption in any of the agencies in charge of certification? Thank you.
Yes, on the costly investments for energy efficiency, environment, transport, those threes. I don't think they're any comprehensive costing document, but the trans-European transport networks, the privileged corridors, I think they all have costs attached to them, which are billions in each of them. With respect to energy efficiency in the households, Actually, I did have a look at that a few years ago and published a detailed paper on it. I mean, these are billions of euro for Ukraine. And other environmental issues, large combustion power plants, which have to be replaced. I mean, again, you're in the billions of euro there.
Thank you so much. We have another question from your side, and then a lady on back side.
Thank you very much. Kacha Gogolashvili from Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies. I want to comment on two issues, and maybe then expecting reaction from distinguished speakers. One issue is the issue of ACA. That ACA, of course, is practically same as mutual recognition agreements, MRAs, but with one difference that mutual recognition agreements mean that you reciprocally, one country and another country reciprocally recognize each other's standards and evaluation practices. And in ACA, so lower country in this sense approximates the stronger country. I mean, country or group, like Ukraine should approximate its legislation to EU, and then ACA is signed. Of course, there is one ACA, I can agree, but there are plenty of mutual recognition agreements with other countries. So we cannot say that there is only one ACA. Yes, I agree on this, but this is partially true because there are mutual recognition agreements with Switzerland, with, I don't know, Norway, with Canada. I don't want to lie, maybe with Japan or maybe not. Yes, with Japan as well, etc. So there are lots of precedents of signing these agreements. And this issue, I think also, association agreement from other side, there is no direct promise of signing that, but there is a saying that ACA will be negotiated due in time when the certain conditions are met. And if Ukraine has ambition, that Ukraine should prove, of course, but not to close this perspective to Ukraine as far as association agreement said. Second thing, okay, I already practically forgot second thing what I wanted to comment, but it is about possibility of 3 countries to. I think that there is some. Important issue that differs or distinguishes 3 associated countries from other 3. It's not about whether we are better or not. Maybe Armenia is better in some things, Georgia is better in others, etc. But Armenia, Belarus, they themselves closed the perspective of further integration with the EU by joining customs union, which means that they cannot have free trade with EU, they cannot progress in integration. This is one thing. Second limitation is the participation of this is the security bloc, which is CSTO. Armenia and Belarus both are members. I'm sorry, just I'm finishing. Just members of CSTO, which means that they cannot progress in the way of CSDP, for example, integration with the EU in security policies. They cannot do it. They can do on certain levels, hybrid threats, etc., but also partially. But deeper, it's not possible. And as regards to Azerbaijan, it has theoretical perspectives in this regard, but it has closed this perspective by not joining WTO. At this moment, the perspective is closed because of. And second thing is political and human rights and other things. So, so these 3 countries differ at least that we have perspective for this by ourselves. But what we need, perspective recognized by EU. This is what is important. Sorry for being so long.
Thank you. Sorry for being so severe in terms of like moderation. Any other comments from our panelists on this? No, because it's except of Luke. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, I think I was expected to comment. So I just want to correct one or two things. First of all, it's the first time I hear a Georgian saying that perhaps Armenians are better in some areas, but this is a South Caucasian jokes. It's okay. But as a veteran of Caucasus negotiations, I can say that. But more seriously speaking, I'm glad you mentioned, you made the distinction between MRAs, mutual recognition agreement, and ACAs. I mean, this is not supposed to be a panel, and I guess the audience is not that interested into all these technicalities. So, and also I should have the colleagues from DG Grow and the other commission services, and I don't have them, so I don't want to speak on their behalf. But I think it's an important point that you make for sure. Where I disagree a bit with you is that because of Eurasian Union joining, you cannot have a closer relation with the EU. That is not true. Personally, I don't think so, and actually it's not, I think, it's objective. Because if you look at the agreements that we have made with, well, either Armenia, but also Kazakhstan, the one I've just initiated in Kyrgyz Republic, the one we're currently negotiating with Uzbek, etc. It is true, of course, there's nothing tariff related, but you can do a lot of getting closer by tariff. In fact, you know that with all WTO negotiations throughout the years, the tariff aspect of the, and I'm sure Taras will agree with that, or Olga, the tariff aspect of a relation remains important in certain aspects, particularly when you have prohibitive tariffs, but this is relatively marginal. The non-tariff barriers, all the regulatory, is much more important nowadays because regulations are more numerous, because they're more strict, because a number of things, and also because of the private sector. Because if you go to want to sell to supermarkets in Europe, they have their own standards, which often are copied on the EU because they don't want any trouble. And if you don't go to these standards, which are private in this case, you will not be able to sell. And so this aspect is important, and this aspect can perfectly be tackled. The devil is in the detail, because some aspects of technical regulations or food safety regulations are the competence of region union, some are not. But if you read, and I could continue with other topics like public procurement, like access to services, etc. My best advice, I'm sure you have done it, but for those who want to understand more, is just to read what we have signed, including economically with countries like Armenia or Kazakhstan. And you will see that despite the non-aspect of the tariff, it does make a difference. And if you look at the development of the trade, you will also see, not of course as much as associated countries with the CFTA, and that's quite logical, but it's not 0 or 1, you know, it's a bit more nuanced than that. On security, of course, membership of CSTO is a political direction that they chose. But we, nevertheless, including with Armenia, we do some things of cooperation in CSDP as well. They can take part in EU missions as well. And so, again, it's not just black and white. But you are, of course, right to differentiate that there's no discussion that compared to Georgia, compared to Armenia or Azerbaijan, Georgia is much more integrated with the EU. This is not the discussion.
Yep, and this, I think that on technical regulations and ACA, this is really funny story, because one thing is what is envisaged in the association agreement. It says what it says. Yes, that the ACA will be added as a protocol to the agreement. But what is more interesting is that technical regulation was the first element of what was offered by the EU as a part of Eastern Partnership in 10 years ago. So that I remember the first meeting on economic section on Eastern Partnership, and what was presented by the EU is technical regulation. And the technical regulations and approximation to the EU standards will help to trade between parties of Eastern Partnership. Definitely, for the moment, no. It creates more obstacles between Ukraine and the EU than increased trade, but nevertheless, so that it was promoted by. Okay, let's not use the word promise. It was promoted by the EU to approximate with EU standards. I said why. We have Soviet standards between Belarus and Georgia, so we can rely on them, but we played that game, so we really use what was promoted by the EU. We approximated. The first action plan on ACA was agreed between Ukraine and the European Commission in 2004, so 15 years ago. So that's why we all this time we lived with promotion of ACA, promotion of approximation of technical regulations to the EU one by European Commission. So that's why I'm not negotiating and requesting anything. That's why it explains why we are so keen on this agreement. So that's why, even if it was not promised, so that I think that this is it explains how we should treat any promises from the EU. But even if it was not promised, I think that it was always promoted by the EU. And if it was promoted of the EU, it creates a lot of anticipations in Ukrainian society. Even if it makes no practical sense, it creates a lot of anticipations in Ukrainian societies. People know that ACA is something which is in association agreement, and some certain one of basic elements of Eastern Partnership policy as well. So that's why it is so advocated by Ukraine or Georgia. Yeah? So that's why it is so important. So that's why we will always request it. Yeah, thank you.
I just want to react on this with one thing. First of all, you cannot mislead people by making them confuse ACA and alignment on technical regulation. These are different things. Different things. And technical regulation, yes, if you prefer to work with the EU market and then the Belarusian market, yes, then you have to go for EU technical regulation, which I think is a bit more promising. And I think that the facts have proven me right, because if you look at the developments of the trade between EU and Ukraine, and the EU now doing what, 45% of the trade of Ukraine, and probably more if we were to remove minerals, it has worked without an ACA. And stop making believe to the people that ACA will, I don't know, pay their bills or something, because then you put yourself in a very complicated situation. And EU has never promoted the ACA as a big thing. The big thing is a technical regulation, because that is the thing that gets you the market access, first and foremost. ACA is the icing on the cake that so far one country has in the world.
Well, definitely I can summarize by saying that this topic was not even started to be discussed. I mean, on ACA and technical regulation, we just pointed out, but we have a floor for only one last question from the lady who were willing for a long time, and we will transfer our discussion to this short part of a coffee break.
Thank you very much. I'm Hanna Bazilov from EU Advisory Mission, and I would like actually to switch the flow of this conversation to the topic of this session, the wider Europe, which also includes Russia. And I would like to ask the panelists, what do you think, how did the military intervention in Ukraine, which was basically done in the middle of Eastern Partnership's policy flow, actually shaped it, influenced it, and how it will influence the future of Eastern Partnership? Because for Ukraine, being in this three associated countries trio meant losing the territory and starting a military conflict in the East. So it's very important for us. Thank you.
Thank you. I would suggest 30 seconds for each speaker, starting from Michael. Oh, well, from Taras. Sorry.
No problem. I think that so that in reality, I think that EEA was concluded after 10 years of Luxembourg process. It was extremely difficult political debate about how EEA should be built. I think that we are in the middle of this process. between Ukraine and the EU. And I think we will result in a good understanding on how integration works with all promises and rules and rights and obligations. But what we are what we are working now is actually developing this concept by means of implementation of DCFTA. That's why I think that all our discussion is also part of implementation of DCFTA and evolving of this cooperation, integration into something which is similar to economic integration, which was promised by the EU from Romana Prodi times. Yeah, so for ages. Yeah.
I'll pass.
How can you pass on Russia? Marius, I thought the EEA was aligned on us. I have soon consultation with your countries on this very topic. Yes, I understand the division of labor. Well, let me first say that the EU has, since 2014, remained constantly supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine, has never has not recognized illegal annexation of Crimea, will continue to do so. I spare you, because I've been asked to only have 30 seconds, the long list of statements and in each and every forum that we do, and this is very important. Secondly, you know that we have imposed sanctions, 3 sets of sanctions, as a consequence of both Donbass and Crimea events, and these are renewed with full consensus, despite whatever you can hear sometimes by individual politicians or individual countries. These are renewed with unanimity. And thirdly, you know that in our so-called 5 principles of our guiding policy for vis-à-vis Russia, the first one is the full implementation of the Minsk Agreement and peace in Donbass. Thank you.
I'm not entitled to speak on behalf of the Polish government, but basically this is what. But this is what I want to say. I mean, no, we do not like the situation as it's going on at the moment with Russia, and I would put down to France this individual actions taken by President Macron. And I would like to, of course, I would be very glad to know on whose behalf Ambassador Ederer in Moscow came up with different new approach on selective cooperation with Russia, because definitely it was not on behalf of Poland. But please expect soon a big debate within the European Union on cooperation with Russia, and I don't think it will go in the direction that Poland and Ukraine would like it to be.
Thank you, Kalis. With this, I announce the ending of our panel.